Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2025, and our friends Colonel Larry Wilkerson and Graham Fuller are back with us. Welcome back, Larry and Graham.
Thank you, Nima.
Thank you.
Let's get started, Larry, with the new Donald Trump talk with Putin, and he talked with both Putin and Zelensky. How do you find it right now? He said that it was so good the way that he was talking with Putin, mutual understanding, and he thinks that he can put an end to the conflict in Ukraine. How do you find it right now? Do you think that Donald Trump finally gets to the point to put an end to the conflict?
I hope so, but I doubt it seriously, just based on not his first 4 years, but his first 20 days or so now. He's all over the map, wherever you want to talk about. The Newsweek piece that was released, I thought, as a purposeful leak by the government, delineated almost everything that I think at least was a good starting point for talking with Putin. Now, whether or not that's the case, that it was a genuine government position leaked by someone around Trump or even his special envoy, I don't know, but it did hit all the right points for a start. There were some things in there that I don't think Putin will ever accept, but it hit the right points for a start. If if Trump regurgitated those to Putin on the phone in any understandable format, then I would say we've made some progress. But then I would go to Hegseth's recent remarks, which were this morning, I think, or last night, and reported in the Washington Post and elsewhere. And although they're encouraging, he said a couple of things that I don't think Putin is in any way, fashion, or form going to accept, one of which is international security force. Now, that depends on who makes up that force, perhaps, but nonetheless, I don't think Putin is going to buy an international security force. I assume somewhere between the warring parties, but I don't know. In any event, it's typical Trump. You got one person saying one thing, Trump saying another person saying another thing, and all our friends and potential enemies in the world. I say potential for Putin because I don't think Putin has to be an enemy to interpret. And one never knows where one is until the final gong, and then maybe you don't know where you are because Trump is just as apt to look at what's happening right now in Gaza with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is going to go beyond the ceasefire and reopen the war. And he feels like Trump gave him carte blanche to do that in a meeting that we didn't hear Donald Trump say that in, certainly, and in which I thought Netanyahu was somewhat like a deer caught in the headlights for an instant there in interpreting what Trump was telling him when he delivered the bombshell that we were going to buy Gaza and ship all the Palestinians out. So I don't know. I can't answer your question with any definitiveness.
Graham.
Yeah, sitting up here in the frozen Canada, I have a slightly different perspective, maybe a little more positive than Larry. For one thing, I was stunned by Pete Hegseth's remarks about the Ukrainian conflict. I mean, he basically said that the U.S. was not going to supply any more serious funding. It was not going to supply any more serious weapons, that the Europeans would have to be on their own and bear the brunt of the responsibility, and that it was time to bring an end to the conflict. Well, as you know too, Larry, very well, Hegseth is supposed to be a super hawk. Maybe Trump brought him in to make a super hawk make those concessions. I don't know. But anyway, I was very encouraged that that he made those remarks. I would not expect that out of early on out of the Secretary of Defense.
I just say one thing there. My reading of Hegseth earlier, during the confirmation, and now, is he's never been for the Ukraine war.
Okay.
He's always been opposed to the Ukraine war in various ways, but opposed to it. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that attracted him to Trump. I don't know that, but I think that.
Larry, do you think that Hegseth going to be able to modify Pentagon the way that Donald Trump wants?
Well, if he does what he said in that town hall, I played that dude twice. I couldn't believe he walked in there and he had a suit coat on and a red tie, everything all photogenic for the cameras and everything. You know, he took his coat off and rolled his sleeves up past the elbows. I thought, well, he's really bearing it. He's showing his tats and everything. And then he got up and he held the people, I think, in some consideration of his words for a good 35 minutes or so. And they didn't have a Q&A. And I thought, oh, he didn't want the Q&A to be publicized. So they're going to check it first. Well, it didn't take long to check it because about 45 minutes later, it was on YouTube. And the Q&A he handled pretty well, too. This was mostly 05s, 06s, equivalent civilians, you know, typical Pentagon audience, but leaving out the lower grade enlisted and so forth. Good questions were asked, and he handled himself really well. And the one thing he said that I found really is going to be a challenge for him, but he gave the remarks with conviction. I've heard people say this before, including Chuck Hagel. I am going, in the 4 years I'm here, to conduct an audit that will pass muster. That is going to be a humongous challenge. He's going to find out as he goes along just how much a challenge it is. Powell once told a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs who called him and said, what would you do if you wanted to get your budget under control? And Powell said, the first thing is cancel 50% of the DOD's contracts, then take the other 50% and go over them with a fine tooth comb. I don't care which 50% you cancel to begin with. You can use any ruler you want to, but you've got to get a handle on these contractors. There are contracts, Nima, that are running for 10, 12, 15 years that no one knows how much money is going out to what contractor. And the contractors love it. They love it, of course. You can swim in that largesse, in that non-audible portion of the DOD budget forever if you're a contractor. So they don't want anything done about that. But that's got to be gotten a handle on. And two chairmen in a row have been unable to convince their secretaries to get a handle on that.
Graham, first time Donald Trump talking directly with Vladimir Putin since he took office in Washington. And he said that it was so positive on, as at least what he was talking about, that the conversation between him and Vladimir Putin was so positive. How do you see the difficulties that he's facing in terms of this communication between the United States and Zelensky and going back to Putin? What are the most important or challenging points for dealing with these two leaders?
Well, I think Hegseth's remarks and Trump's remarks all along have sent clear signals to Zelensky that his days are numbered. And sometimes I'm amazed that Zelensky has survived as long as he has. But I think there can be no doubt that that Zelensky's days, as I say, are truly numbered now. But more important, I think it was very clear that Trump isn't particularly upset about those remarks, and made very sure that the warmth of his remarks were towards Putin and not towards Ukraine or Zelensky himself. On Putin, one huge change is that it's an American cottage industry is to portray Vladimir Putin as the devil, as a savage, primitive, dangerous enemy, all kinds of adjectives that are used against him. When actually, I would have to say, from my perspective, I've had a lot to do with Russians in my day. I speak Russian. I find Putin very calm, essentially, very sober, very realistic, unlike the dialogue, most of the language that comes out of Washington, D.C. And I think Trump feels that this is a guy that he can make a deal with. And that, of course, is Trump's main claim to fame is this, that he's transactional. So I think I'm rather optimistic about this. I may be quite disillusioned quickly, disappointed, but I think Trump wants a deal, and I think Putin wants a deal. And if they both want a deal, it's probably going to work. And the Europeans, furthermore, are put on notice that if they don't like it, it's too bad. If they want to save Ukraine, they're welcome to go ahead and do their own thing. But Europe has no policy. NATO is Europe's policy. Europe has no independent leadership. So it's all between Trump and Putin, as far as I can see.
Larry.
I agree with everything Graham just said. My one footnote or caution, and Graham knows this, is that Trump started out like a lightning rod with Kim Jong-un and then just gave up the race. Everyone wants to say that John Bolton screwed him. I don't doubt that for a moment, but a president who gets screwed by someone like John Bolton ought to go hide his head in the closet. I just hope that nothing like that comes along, and I hope Trump can, let's put it this way, stay the course. He seems to have an awful lot of challenge staying the course, saying something, then putting in motion the actions to fulfill that something, and then following through. That seems to be his biggest failure. And I'd like to see that not be a failure, as Graham said, because I think all the ingredients are there for a deal.
Larry, when when you look at Europe today, it seems that they're so worried about Donald Trump, and they're talking about NATO having some sort of NATO for Europeans. And how is that? What's going on in the mind of Europeans, in your opinion? And are they really concerned about what Donald Trump is doing or he'll do in the future?
Sure. I mean, everybody is concerned because he's so unpredictable. That may be part of his gift, if you will, that he's keeping everyone off balance. And I suppose this is a negotiating tactic in some way or other. But I think all Europe's top leaders seem to be speaking with one voice, except for Viktor Orban and maybe the president of Slovakia. But otherwise, they seem to be speaking in one voice about Ukraine and undying support forever for Ukraine. I get the sense from what I follow in Europe is that there is deep concern at the popular level among the electorate as to the whole direction that this Ukraine war has taken Europe. In effect, it's really destroyed the German economy. It's made other economies very difficult in Europe with the absence of cheap Russian energy. So I think Europe is going to be in a process of more and more disillusionment about following the American Pied Piper, if you know that story, Nima, of the guy German who attracted all the kids of Europe out of Europe playing his magic flute. It's a story that everybody knows. And I think Europe may realize now that this has not been a good deal, not a good experiment. And I would go so far as to say, I think the future of NATO is now very much in doubt. And just to offer one very irresponsible remark on my part, I think that's to the good myself. I do not believe that NATO has truly kept the peace in Europe. I think NATO has contributed to this war in Ukraine, and I, for one, and I'm not alone in this, people who know more about it than I do, but this may be the beginning of the end of NATO.
Larry, is that the beginning of the end of NATO?
Well, if you remember any interviews you've done with me, I said that a long time ago.
Okay.
And something else. I listened to Stoltenberg yesterday, and he was almost apoplectic trying to convince his audience, which wasn't the audience to whom he was speaking directly, it was in Washington, that the Europeans are on track for meeting their defense commitments. He just went on and on about that. We're up to 2% now. We're going to go to 3%. And it was like, Donald, please listen to me. And that's a great indicator for me. If Jens Stoltenberg is doing that, then he's worried.
Right.
Larry, how about European? Does Europe need a something like NATO to defend themselves? Is
If
there
I
any sort of threat coming from Russia? I don't know, from China. Who's going to attack them?
if I were working, genuinely working and king for a day, so to speak, on a European security architecture, I would want Russia to be a part of it. Very
Absolutely.
much I'd want Russia to be a part of it. Even to the point where I would promise NATO stand down for CSTO stand down and Russia's membership, powerful and meaningful membership in a new European security architecture. Now, I don't know how Putin would be able to handle that with the CSTO partners. Maybe he could CSTO minus or something. I don't know. But we'd have an easier time, I think, divesting ourselves of NATO than maybe he would of CSTO. But I'm not that familiar with how firm CSTO is in terms of the leadership right now. I think it just follows Russia because Russia's the big guy on the block. So if we could do that, if we could craft this agreement leading into two things, Nima, leading into you bring North Korea in and we'll bring Israel in, and we want a new multilateral, all 9 weapon states nuclear agreement. And at the same time, we want a new European security architecture, and we want you to be a meaningful member of it, Russia. I think that would be a real change for the better, ultimately.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Larry, that's fascinating. I mean, it's beyond my wildest dreams to imagine that you could bring Kim Jong-un and Netanyahu into the same agreement, but who knows? I mean, maybe this crazy new world that Trump may be creating, it could bring that about. But I think Russia would be ready for that. Indeed, if we look back, there have been 3 Russian premiers now, starting with Gorbachev, and then with Yeltsin, and then with Putin, of course, now. All of them have been interested and have mentioned the idea of a common European security agreement that would include, that would include the security interests of all the states of Europe, not just Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia itself. I mean, what's the good of a security arrangement if it doesn't even meet the security needs and concerns of half of Europe and the most important state in Europe, namely Russia? So I think there could be a deal here to be made, but the opposition to it in places like Washington, where, as I say, it's a cottage industry to hate Russia. It's been going on for a long, long, long time. We inherited these fears of Russia from the British, who, going back to their own colonial days, were terrified that Russia was going to invade India, colonial India, over the Himalaya mountains. So the English have taught us well about the enemy, the dangerous nature of Russia. Anyway, so I think there is a deal to be made there, but a lot of opposition. No, Larry would know far more about this than I do, about from the military-industrial complex, from European elites that do not represent, I think, European public opinion, but that like to have these tensions and these military organizations, which helps make Europe more important, which I'm afraid I think Europe is increasingly less important in this world.
Yeah, Graham, we in my administration began the massive propagandization of European peoples to get the governments we have there now. They do not represent, in most cases, the majority of their countries. We put them in place. And we put Jens Stoltenberg in place at the same time. I mean, we started with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, working on each of the capitals that we thought was vulnerable, to include the Scandinavian countries, and putting in place propaganda campaigns and assets to support those campaigns, both indigenous and on our side, CIA mostly. And we put them in there to convince a minority to be able to win an election over a majority and enter NATO. That was an incredible campaign, And Powell at the time said, this will fail. Au contraire, it didn't fail. It worked.
Well, yeah, that's fascinating, Larry. You were far closer to it than I was. But I think it's very clear that NATO is the preeminent instrument for American control of European foreign policy. And Europeans really have very little say in this thing. I mean, when I talk to Europeans about NATO, they say, well, we don't really have any control over it. And our foreign policy is NATO, and whatever NATO wants, NATO gets. So the number of institutions that would be threatened by the elimination or folding down of NATO is quite formidable, and probably harder than to reach an agreement on that than it would be on reaching an agreement over Ukraine.
Just think about the number, Nima, of 4 stars and 3 stars. I mean, that's it's a huge bureaucracy, and they don't want to lose their stars. You know, we have more general officers, and every time we have a general officer, NATO has to create one. Or maybe in some cases, each one of the key countries like Germany, France, and Britain have to create one. So we have an admiralty and a generalcy that's all associated with NATO. My God, they'd fight tooth and nail with their claws to keep that from happening.
Larry, do you think that right now, the situation in Germany would help Donald Trump, or would be against the way that Donald Trump wants to, I don't know, define the relationship between the United States and Europe?
If Merz winds up being the chancellor, if the coalition is built to put Merz in the chancellorship and brings the kind of policies that I think he will bring, having been a CEO of BlackRock, then I think he and Trump will probably get along initially. But it might be difficult to sustain that companionship, as it were, because I think the Germans are going to increasingly, as Graham was suggesting, and the French too, the 2 keys outside Turkey, are going to be thinking differently too. And so it's going to be hard to maintain, especially if Trump continues to scare people like Stoltenberg, like he just did. I don't see how Trump maintains good relations with Berlin or with Paris if it becomes strictly transactional and they're still recovering from their trauma over essentially our withdrawal from NATO.
There's also the issue of the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, which is widely, you know well about this, Larry. I would think they would get along with Trump fairly well. They don't like the U.S., but they also don't want to, and for that reason, don't want to be led around by the U.S. But I don't know. How do you think they would get along with Trump?
I think you're right that the group that is sort of central to it would get along with him. I'm not sure. I don't want to say, but maybe I'm wrong, that fringe element that they're having trouble with all the time would get along with him, because they're as much like Elon Musk. They're difficult to deal with. I had a person in the AfD who's sort of in the mid-level leadership, and she told me that they're scared of those people. Even these are the really wild Nazi-like people in the AfD.
Yeah. Just shifting the gear to the conflict in the Middle East, Donald Trump talked with the King of Jordan, and he said that he's going to convince him to accept Palestinians. He's talking the same way about Egypt, and we know that Sisi has postponed his visit to Washington. What are we witnessing, Larry, in the Middle East right now?
Well, with Jordan, the King of Jordan, I watched him with great pain in my heart for him, and also great angst in my heart, and even maybe building hatred because he just sat there and took it. This is the man whose predecessor as king refused, at great peril to the state of Jordan, to join the United States in its war in Iraq first time around. Absolutely refused. And if it hadn't been for H.W. Bush's tolerance of that, he did punish him, but he didn't punish him nearly as badly as he could have. And people say, well, it's because of the treaty with Israel and all this. No, it was because they actually had a relationship. So, funny thing, these things call relationships, you know, diplomatic relationships, leadership relationships that are genuine. And HW was that way. HW would do 2 hours of diplomacy on the telephone himself personally. That king would never have sat there. He would never have sat there. He would either have gotten up, excused himself, and walked out, or he would have challenged Trump very diplomatically and carefully, and he was good at that, but he would have challenged him. This king just sat there and took it. Sisi, at least, didn't come, called it off. So I don't know what's going to happen with Jordan. That signified to me that Jordan was going to sit there and take it ultimately if Trump says 1 million Palestinians are going to cross your border tomorrow morning. Don't think that'll happen because Netanyahu wants to get back to killing them again as soon as this first phase is over. That's what he's going to do, get back to killing them again. Got it all ready. That's what he wanted this 42 roughly days for, was to retrofit, refit, let rest the IDF because it's really, really in some trouble. It's never fought this long a war. It's never been on the battlefield this long. It's never taken this kind of casualties over such a long period of time on both fronts, Hezbollah and Gaza. And it really is reluctant to go back to war in Gaza, but he's got new leadership who are all sycophants of his. I'm not sure that they're not going to turn because military people have a tendency to not like to see their people losing, not accomplishing a single strategic objective, which they have not, and yet go back at it again. And that's what I think Netanyahu's intent is, to go right back at it again.
Graham.
Yeah, I agree with Larry, absolutely. I think there's absolutely no chance that King Hussein can accept any kind of serious group of Palestinian refugees coming into Jordan. I mean, we already know it's more than half. Jordan is more than half Palestinian population already, and there are serious tensions between the traditional, more Bedouin background type of East Bankers and the Palestinian Jordanian. So to bring more Palestinians is more problem. And also I think King Hussein, under those circumstances, knows that he probably might not survive if that were to take place. If the King of Jordan were seen to be complicit in helping undermine a Palestinian state, the position, the welfare of Palestinians, I think he could have a very, very dangerous situation on his hand, and so would Sisi. Sisi knows that well enough, and that may be one of the reasons why Sisi doesn't want to come and have to face it. I wasn't sure what I read quite recently, that after King Hussein walked out of the meeting, that there was some kind of message that he was sent back, or clarification that he would not go so far as to accept it. I'm not sure I'm getting that exactly right, but he knows what the challenge is to him. I think most Arab leaders realize that they are in very, very vulnerable positions, some more than others. But it's pretty shocking if you consider that there is not one single Arab leader, with the exception of the poor Houthi Yemenis. There's not one single Arab leader that is supportive, even rhetorically very much, of the Palestinian cause. It's ironic that the two states that are really supporting the Palestinian cause, both rhetorically and beyond, are non-Arab Turkey and non-Arab Iran. They've got more guts than any of the Arab leadership does.
To the eternal embarrassment of the Arab League.
Yes.
I think Mohammed bin Salman's whole, I think his whole idea or wish, I guess I should say, is to just get this problem off his plate and start building his complexes. Get the Palestinians out of here. If you could send them to Alaska, I'll buy them plane tickets.
Larry, do you think that they're afraid of Palestinians because they're afraid of, I don't know, some sort of changes that would bring some sort of changes to their own countries? That's why they're
the same thing Graham was just saying about the current king was operative with that king during the first Iraq War. And Bush understood that. There were only about 6 million Palestinians there at that time, 5 3/4, I think, or something like that. But it still it presented a real challenge to the Bedouin class. And so Bush understood that and gave him a break. He knew that he would probably be putting himself in jeopardy, and the jeopardy today is far greater than the jeopardy then that the king would have been putting himself in by not being supportive of a fellow Arab leader. And he wasn't supportive of him with arms or money or anything. He just failed to join the coalition and condemn Saddam Hussein. So today it's much more difficult and much more dangerous for the sitting king. Yeah.
I agree. Also, Nima, I think it's important to, I think maybe even in an earlier conversation with you some time back, there's real fear and also almost hatred, loathing, if you will, of the Palestinians on the part of much of Arab leadership, like in Jordan. Not like in Saudi Arabia or in the Gulf states, mainly because they represent a deeply angry, unhappy population that is seeking to agitate, to march, to call for confrontation, to call for a more radical approach to the problem of the solution of the Palestinians. These Gulf leaders hate that kind of thing. They don't want demonstrations for any cause. They don't like to see people in the streets talking about justice or any of these things. They want them to be quiet and happy and shut up. So Palestinians are potential. They make waves in the societies in which they live for very legitimate reasons. I mean, they've been screwed over very badly in their life in Palestine, and these other leaders don't want unhappy people, angry people, radical people in their countries.
And I'll just add to that: there's no place more composite, intense, and dangerous in that regard than the place where we have our largest fleet headquarters now, Bahrain.
That's right.
And when you look at Donald Trump and the way that he's insisting that he's able to solve the problem in Gaza between Israel and Palestinians, and at the same time he's totally disconnected when he's talking about removing or displacing the Palestinians from their land. How someone, when we talk about Donald Trump, we'd say that he knows what he wants, and he put it in a simple way to solve it. And but the conflict is much more complicated, and just displacing people and taking over their land is not the solution. It's going to be another front to the problem.
Yeah, there is no obvious. I mean, people have been working and talking about the Palestinian problem now for decades and decades, and nobody really has come up with an idea that will be accepted. There are ideas that might work, such as the two-state solution conceivably, but it's unacceptable to Israel, so it's out of consideration. So I doubt, with the best will in the world, that Trump can bring about any solution. He can pressure, he can squeeze the Jordanians, he can squeeze the Egyptians, But the Arab leaders know that this would be a suicidal mission if they were to permit Israel to complete the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And the Saudis themselves have said no relations with Israel until there is a serious makings of a Palestinian right on the table. It's Yeah, I think it's very dangerous, and the way things are going right now, I wouldn't be surprised if we were leading towards a new regional war. There's only so much I think the Arab populations can take of insults, of being denied their rights, or watching Washington support Israel to the last degree. At some point, there's going to be an explosion again. I would put Egypt high on that list. And as Larry said, Bahrain, very serious point. I mean, as Larry said, this is where our fleet is. On top of this, in Bahrain, which is a majority Shiite population, but it's run by a Sunni government, which treats the Shiite majority very badly. So, there are a lot of truly explosive situations out there, and I fear we may be heading towards another war in the absence of a regional war, in the absence of some more serious move towards a solution. I don't see that on the horizon of a solution.
Nima,
Larry, are we heading? Larry,
I was
go ahead.
I was doing some map work with a couple of colleagues last night, and we were looking at the inroads Israel's making in Syria now, well beyond even the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, mainly taking water and agricultural land and one dam. We were looking at the disposition of Turkish forces, and we were looking at what Sisi's facing really in Egypt. And we even pulled out National Geographic articles to read about the dilemma Egypt is in right now. They do not have enough food for their own people. They do not have enough water for their own people. And it's not just a tad short, it's majorly short in both categories. You dump another million people on Egypt, and they would have no choice. The tanks would roll. The army would move, and they'd commit suicide. They'd think, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. But if you sat down and you said, okay, let's say that Erdogan doesn't like what's happening in Syria and moves his armored columns down along the border there. Let's say that Jordan and Egypt coordinate with it. Now, they have pretty formidable armored forces, very, very good armored forces. And all of a sudden, the IDF is confronted not with people coming out of tunnels with AKs or, grenades or whatever they bring out with them. They're confronted with a first line army that has some capacity, and they're taken by surprise. Now, one of the colleagues said was, oh, Mossad would ferret that out. They'd ferret that out and they'd be ready for that. They'd attack them. Well, that would certainly take them off their current points of contact, as it were, in Lebanon, where they want the ceasefire extended through mid-February or late February, they said yesterday. So obviously they're having some problems. And oh, by the way, they haven't not killed somebody every single day of both ceasefires. And in most cases, multiple somebodies. So that's how Israel honors both ceasefires, one with Lebanon and the one with Gaza. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it is conceivable that you could have armies moving to destroy Israel, and Israel in such a belabored position that she were destructible. And what would that do? And one guy said, well, he'd pull out his nuclear weapon. How do you use a nuclear weapon on yourself? Well, it's called the Samson option. Okay, let's don't go there. But these people, I agree with Graham, these people are going to get tired of this. They're going to get tired of it, and they don't have any alternatives other than just saying, okay, I give up and go away.
Larry, I think you put your finger on one of the deeper issues of the Middle East here. Everybody talks about it as a long-term problem. Indeed, it is. But the problem is that there has never, ever been a serious approach to peace in the Middle East. The only policy the United States has had is protect Israel. That's just, and to maybe keep the Russians out or keep the Soviet Union out back in the day. But Russians are back in anyway. But what is much more important is the US's only game has been to pay Arab states not to go to war with Israel. There's no love there. There's no real peace at work. They're simply being paid to be nice. As long as they can go on. How long will the American public want to keep on paying Arab states to be nice to Israel or be nice to each other? Trump is talking about wasting taxpayers' money. That's been a taxpayers' waste of money for 40 years at least in a serious failure to address the fundamental issues of it, other than throw money at it and put pressure on them to be nice to Israel.
D'accord, mon ami.
Larry, can we understand Donald Trump? On one hand, he doesn't like any sort of new conflicts and wars. On the other hand, the way that he's handling the situation in the Middle East is going to lead to a new conflict, or maybe Israel attacking again Gazans, Palestinians, and we know that Yemenis, Houthis, and Sarallah, whatever we can call them, are ready to attack Israel if something happens. Not just Yemenis. We have Hezbollah. It's just today we've learned that the president of Lebanon was complaining about that Israel didn't withdraw its forces from southern Lebanon.
I didn't mention what we concluded our discussion with. If Israel were in extremis under circumstances roughly like what we described, would the United States put boots on the ground to help them? The consensus was, well, we divided it. We said, would the United States do it as the United States? Then we said, would the United States do it with Donald Trump as president? Because that's the reality we're confronting right now. Actually, under both questions, we said no. We'd let them go down. Echoing my point that I don't think we're Israel's puppet. Israel is our puppet. And when that puppet gets in such extremes that we risk something significant in order to defend them, we won't. And I think under Donald Trump, that's magnified. I don't know, but that's the conclusion we came to.
Do you think Bibi understands that?
I doubt it. I really do. I think he believes that the analogy or the truth is that we're his puppet, and that if it gets that way, we will come with all bells shining and ringing. And I think that's what he really believes.
Yeah. I don't know if that would help the situation with Palestinians, but after all, Larry.
Well, a nuclear weapon used in a desperate move would not help anybody.
Yeah.
That's why that was our biggest concern in the past about Ukraine. We've come away from that concern a bit now. Now our concern has shifted to that kind of thing in the Levant.
They were so hopeful about the new government in Lebanon, Graham. And with the new president, new prime minister, and they thought that they can make some sort of division between Hezbollah and the new government. How do you think that the way that Israel is behaving toward Lebanon would bring these two parties together?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know that there's an easy answer. Hezbollah, of course, is the most significant military and paramilitary force in Lebanon. The Christian and some of the other populations, non-Muslim populations within Jordan. I mean, sorry, within
Lebanon.
Lebanon. There's no love lost between them and Hezbollah. On the other hand, I think any Lebanese government is aware that without Hezbollah, they are virtually naked, and they open to anything that Israel would choose to do. So I would suspect that whatever they think about Hezbollah and however much they fear the independent power of Hezbollah, they cannot afford to do without it.
That's always, I think, been their dilemma ever since Hezbollah stood up, and particularly since it became politically as well as militarily oriented.
Yeah.
Larry, in your opinion, what would be the reaction if Israel goes again attacking Gazans? What would be the reaction? And all of these parties getting back to the conflict with Israel, Houthis, Hezbollah, and all of them, maybe Iraqis. What would be the reaction on the part of Donald Trump? Is he going to send the U.S. troops, forces to help Netanyahu?
Well, I'll give you what came out of that discussion last night. Donald Trump will forget Miriam Adelson's $100 million as it becomes important for him to do so. It won't mean squat after it becomes important for him to do so, and he acknowledges that in his own brain. Gone. All that Zionist money will be gone. He will then do what he thinks is best for himself and his entourage. And I have to say, I think probably what he deems best for the country he's president of. And that means no. That means if you get yourself in a trick bag and it's existential, we're not coming for you. Now, I'll back up a minute and apply that to your question. If Netanyahu goes back, closes the Netzarim corridor, catches those who've crossed already back into their homes and blows them out of existence, and then launches attacks back down towards Rafah again, Khan Yunis and other places, I think Trump's going to cut him loose. I think he's going to cut him loose. I don't know what that means. Is it just rhetorical, or is it fundamental? Does he just say to Netanyahu, "You're on your own now. No more armaments, no more what?" Or does he keep giving him everything and hope that he survives? I don't know. We couldn't come to a conclusion over what, but we were absolutely adamant that he will resume as soon as the ceasefire's over. He'll resume, and he wants all the hostages back. Before that, he wants them all back, every single one of them, and he's counting on at least one individual's intelligence was he's counting on most of them being dead, and so that's not going to be very traumatic. He's going to get them to force to admit that they're all dead, or majority of them are dead. And so when he launches it again, he will either have compelled, as he's trying to do, all the hostages to be back before he does it, or the greater number of them that are still alive, and then it won't matter with him. It didn't matter with him all along anyway, but now it damn sure won't matter to him.
Yeah, I share your view, Larry, in the sense that I wouldn't dare predict at this point whether Trump would support Netanyahu in the case of extreme danger for Israel. You make a very good point about Miriam Adelson and her $100 million. I think she's already paid the money. What have you done for me recently? Kind of argument comes in. It's Trump is cannot be reelected again. He could, in the theory, say he owes nothing to her anymore. But I just don't know what the mood of Congress at this point. Israel is so alienated. Forget about the rest of the world we know about, but even in America, I think there's been a very significant shift in attitudes towards Israel and the genocide of Palestinians, even on the part of large number of Jews, American Jews, who are sickened by the state that they once thought was an admirable moral state that clearly, in the face of in the face of the world is not that. So I just don't know where it would go. But if the U.S. did intervene, I tend maybe to think it just might. I would give a tiny edge, maybe, Larry, to that it would intervene in some way, but I don't know. The U.S. position now is very naked in the entire world. I mean, everybody is turned against us, and that was before Trump. And now Trump, for whatever reason, is creating disgust and contempt towards the U.S. all globally. So I just don't know how much we can afford to be isolated in that same way. And with China very smartly, very smoothly avoiding military issues entirely and simply talking about trade missions and investments across the global South. They're doing it very successfully, whereas the U.S. policy seems all along for decades now to have been based simply on security arrangements and sale of weapons. And that's okay, maybe countries want that, but that's not satisfying enough for, I think, most of what the world would like to see from a global leadership.
Larry, Trump has signed an executive order cutting aid to South Africa over its genocide case against Israel, and also accusing the country of racism against white people. And here is the response coming from South Africa. They're saying that we'll not be bullied by Donald Trump, and we're going to continue. How do you see the position? To what extent they can sustain this sort of pressure from the United States?
This is Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance behind both initiatives. The first initiative, of course, actually arose in the Biden administration, and they just picked it up. But this initiative to give the white man his due in South Africa after he's been so terribly discriminated against for the past 30 years or so, that's pure Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance. It remains to be seen if Trump will go along with both aspects of that, and certainly the second aspect, which is going to become more and more naked as we go along. I don't think South Africa has any choice but to stand up against it, to do what it can to combat it. Now, if we start sanctioning South Africa, is that going to be a real bad thing for South Africa? I'm not even sure. I'd have to go to OFAC, Nima. Sincerely, I'd have to go to OFAC again and get them to give me their list. I bet they're already on the sanctions list because 32 countries are on the sanctions list. 2.6 billion people are laboring every day underneath U.S. sanctions of one sort or another. Some of them truly draconian, like the ones against Iran. So I don't know. I don't know if South Africa could certainly survive it. And would that just increase the isolation of America? You bet. You bet.
Graham.
Yeah, I don't know. I was a little bit surprised to see South Africa coming into the picture in this way. Also, Elon Musk has spoken out personally, I think, in being very hostile to anything that seems to be weakening the position of whites in South Africa. Elon Musk, I mean, this is the other wild card in the whole Washington scene. I thought I knew something about Elon Musk. I had a Tesla for some years, which I really loved. I admired, Trump, I'm not Trump, Musk is a guy who makes things. This is not somebody who just plays the stock market and buying and selling and manipulating funds and money. He makes real things, important things, so Skylink and very interesting cars and brain inserts and God knows whatever else. But I sense somehow that he has become much more conservative in very recent years that surprises me, and he seems now to be on board with Trump. Maybe it's because Trump put pressure on him. I don't know, but in sympathizing with Trump's concern over the status of white people in in South Africa. Where where Musk comes out on so many of these other issues, it's also harder to guess right now. I would have said he would have been slightly more liberal and flexible a year or two ago, but he seems to be changing because he's in the White House. I don't know what the reason is.
Just to echo what Graham was saying in a more focused way in terms of our military, what I'm hearing from the ranks, and I mean the officership too, what I'm hearing is not only this business about Christian nationalism, but accompanying that is a business of white supremacy. And lots of comments going unchecked, unguarded, unpunished, untempered, uncounseled about how white men ought to be running the entire apparatus.
In South Africa?
No, in the United States military.
Oh, okay. Wow. Wow.
Which really, you know, I thought if Trump was in any way attuned with this, that he would do what he hinted twice, as I recall, in the election campaign, he was going to do, and that was get rid of, he didn't say the black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he just said the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown. I watched CQ's body language beside Trump because he was sitting just to the right of him as he was meeting with Netanyahu. And I couldn't interpret anything from the body language, but I would dare say that everyone who communicated with me about this issue thought CQ was shivering in his boots when Trump was inaugurated, expecting fully to go. And he's still there. So I don't think this is an attitude that started at the top with Donald Trump. I think it started beneath with some of the recruits that he brought into his entourage. And it's nonetheless dangerous because it's happening in the military. If it gets out the way it's getting out right now about women and about people of color, it's going to be disastrous for the military.
Nima, could I just ask Larry a question myself?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Long been interested. Larry, I've been fascinated as a non-military guy by the many interviews I've seen with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Where does Macgregor stand in all of this, and how much do you think he has any influence on Trump or on U.S. policy? I sometimes hear that he's respected by Trump, but I don't have a clue. What's your reading of him?
I think he is respected by Trump, and I think every time he's on Napolitano in particular, but other places too, I think some of that makes its way back to Trump. And very frankly, I like Doug. I think sometimes I think he's politicking for a job. He really wanted to be Secretary of Defense. And I think he would be very good Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure he would survive Trump, but if anybody could, he would. So in that sense, I think what he says and does with regard to Trump is probably more often than not reflective of the truth. But I always have to kind of counsel myself that Doug's looking for a job, so take that into account when you listen to some of his remarks.
Yeah. Larry, here is what the Iranian President Pezeshkian said, that Iran and its people cannot be intimidated. We will not retreat or surrender to any threat. We are not at war with any nation. We have built friendship with all our friends and neighbors. And here is, Larry, when you look at the way that Donald Trump is dealing with the situation of Iran and the way that he's talking about negotiations, all of that, it seems that he's putting the president in Iran in a corner, in a position that it's getting much more difficult to talk with Donald Trump. In other words, he's not helping the situation. He's just worsening the situation between Iran and the United States.
I don't know that that's true. I told you, I think before, that I listened to Javad Zarif at Davos, and then I watched what Trump was doing with Hegseth and with the Department of Defense initially, and I got the very distinct impression that Hegseth was of a mind with Trump with regard to the military's counsel that we do not want a war with Iran. Not only that we got fairly decent affirmation of the fact that we didn't want it as the tail end of Israel's attack on Iran, reinforcing them or bailing them out or whatever. And then I got, this is all prep for what is a very vulnerable Iran now, somewhat deflated a bit by the latest developments between Tehran and Moscow, but not enough to where this isn't still probably pertinent. Iran was in a perfect position to negotiate again. And then I go back to Zarif when he said we're willing to even go beyond things like moratoria that won't be, it'll last forever. It'll be a typical English deal, you know, Starmer and a 100-year deal. We'll have a 100-year deal. It won't have a sunset clause or anything like that. And he was willing to introduce new topics like their ballistic missiles, which they were never willing to introduce during the JCPOA talks. So all of that combined to tell me that I thought they were probably talking on the side through Oman probably, and they were getting ready to set up a deal sometime in the first year of Trump's administration where they would negotiate and Trump would go away and say, I now have the TPCOA, the Trump plan, you know, whatever. But I don't know. And then the Russians landed their AN-24s, I think they are there. They're big, heavy transports and offloaded Su-35E flankers, you know, top line fighters. And someone asked me last night, they said, what do you think they'll do with those? I said, well, the Russians will set up the new equipment training team school and they will train Iranian pilots in it. But that takes about 6 months. So if there's a war between now and those 6 months, the Russians will fly the planes. And they'll shoot the Israeli F-35s down. Okay, well, that's a formidable development. Only if he delivers squadron after squadron after squadron. But right now, I think we only have the start of one squadron. But there are different irons in the fire now than when I was talking about. I thought a deal was probably 60% assured. But I still think that's what Trump would prefer. He'd prefer to throw that out as a huge diplomatic success in his first year. I got a deal that'll work and hold.
Yeah.
And I think the new president of Iran and the other power centers in Tehran would probably go along with that.
Nima, if I could just make one point here, a more general point, but concerns me on so much of these discussions we have about the region. I constantly challenge the supposition that we have to have an enemy and we have to go to war. Invariably, I mean, the U.S. loves Iran because without Iran, you don't really have a major role for the United States in the Persian Gulf. So I somehow wonder if Washington would ever really want to reach some kind of agreement. I mean, you know, for years we've told the Gulfies, we'll back you. There's the constant dimension of Iranian threat, never ending for over decades, selling weapons, the Iranian threat, all of this. And then suddenly the Chinese walked in 18 months ago and worked out some peace deal between Iran and the UAE, I think it was, or Saudi Arabia, which was a remarkable accomplishment because we all knew, quote unquote, that these are eternal hatreds between Arabs and Persians. They're always going to hate each other. So we've got to come in and support the Arabs against the terrible Persians. This, you know, it just shows how shallow this understanding is of what is a true enemy and a threat. I mean, you can turn these things around overnight, really, and that's what the Chinese managed to negotiate. I don't think that there's any absolute reason why we have to go to war with Iran or be hostile to Iran, except for two things. We have never forgiven the hostage crisis when Iran seized 100 and something American diplomats during the fall of the Shah. You remember when they took over the embassy. That's number one. And secondly, the fear of nuclear proliferation on Iran. But basically, I think Iran serves a valuable purpose for American strategy, just as Russia does, and in a way, just as China does. We love to wave these these threats and dangers that only Washington can help rescue you from these threats. It's the world does not have to work that way, but that's the way it seems to be the American operating philosophy. Other countries do it too, but especially it's the heart of American strategic thinking.
Yeah.
Graham, I may be dead wrong, but I think Trump thinks the same way you do.
Oh, come on. Really?
Yeah. I think about Iran, I think Trump thinks that that's the silliest thing on the face of the earth, and we need to get rid of it. That's one reason he doesn't.
Why do you say that,
reason.
Larry?
Well, I've listened to his remarks about the stupidity of, first of all, the war with Iraq, and then second of all, the stupidity of what a war with Iran would be like. He buys the Pentagon's position that it would be a tragedy for the United States to get involved in that 90 million person country that has the strategic depth of half of Russia and terrain to match it. It would be insane for us to get involved there. It'd be worse than the second Iraq war. So he has no inclination whatsoever to go to war with Iran. And he does have an inclination to do better deals than Joe Biden did, either as vice president or as president.
Fascinating.
And
Yeah.
that's the reason I told you, Nima, I think he's got emissaries already working through the good offices of Oman and already talking with the government in Tehran. I think they're just biding their time and waiting. And this business in Gaza doesn't help. That it's not only distracting, it's also impactful, perhaps, before it's over with.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
We didn't even talk about Syria being pretty clear now for Iranian legions to march. So you got Turkey, Iran, Jordan, Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry and Graham, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Good. Thank you, Nima. Really interesting issues. And Larry, I appreciate your insights very much.
I appreciate yours. And Nima, I appreciate
I appreciate both of you.
you can stir us all up from south of Sao Paulo.
See you soon.
Okay, good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.